Welcome everybody who is looking at this first webinar. Perdón, voy a hablar en español. Bienvenidos a todos los que están viendo estos webinars.
Welcome to all of you that are listening to this webinar series. I'm going to begin by introducing myself. My name is Edme Dominguez. I'm a retired professor of international relationships. I worked in the Gothenburg University in Sweden and formed part of a research group that also forms part of WIDE Plus, a European network focused on economic rights that has worked for many years on gender issues within the free trade agreements. We form part of the Mexican Human Rights Initiative that organizes these seminars. These webinars that begin today form part of the campaign of a Mexican-European network to stop the modernization of the global accord between the European Union and Mexico that's been active since 2001 and that seeks to reaffirm its role in trade, both through the European Parliament and the Mexican government. The global agreement between the European Union and Mexico became active in 2001, as I said, and it has had many negative consequences for Mexico in terms of the deterioration of labor conditions, of the environment, and unfair competition by European companies. Why do we want to stop this so-called modernization of the trade treaty? Well, we've seen a number of terrible consequences for the economy and the society in Mexico. To understand the analysis that we've made of this supposed modernization or renewal of the treaty, it would be helpful if you would look at the letter that this network wrote up and that we have included a link in the chat so you can take a look at this letter. We ask you to read it, to examine it, and if you're willing to, that you sign it, because we are still collecting signatures. As I said before, this is a series of 3 webinars to talk about the experience from the perspective of women from various different sectors of civil society about the consequences and the effects of the EU-Mexico agreement beginning in 2001. The first webinar, which is today, gathers up the experiences of the maquila workers. They will talk about the situation of the maquila in Tehuacan and the experiences of workers in the network of agrarian field workers. The second webinar, which will take place in 1 week on October 13th, will be focused on peasant and indigenous women's organization and issues of land, water, mining, and the environment. The third webinar, 1 week later, will have its basic subject, human rights, because all European Union trade agreements have clauses about democracy and human rights. These are binding, and the signatory countries are obliged to respect these. Here we talk about the situation of violence faced by millions of Mexican disappearances, feminicide, and victims of militarization in Mexico. Now we will pass to the presentation of the topics of today's webinar. We will do so through my presentation about the case of Electrolux in Mexico. And now I will make myself a panelist, and then afterwards I will give the floor to our companions who are with us today. The case that I'm going to present is of a Swedish company, therefore the European Union, established in Ciudad Juárez. that has over 50,000 workers. This is a paradigmatic case because it's the case of a conflict that began in April of 2020 with a spontaneous protest by the workers of Electrolux to protest the lack of security equipment at the moment in which COVID was being spread most urgently. They demanded this protection equipment that the company had not planned or taken into account and was not prepared to provide. There were workers that were already ill, and there were even workers that had died due to the pandemic, and the company did not take any measures. So there was a spontaneous protest, and arising from this protest, the management of this company reacted violently and fired 100 workers. As we said, this was a spontaneous worker. There are no unions representing this company. As you know, the unions in the maquilas in the north of Mexico exist only in the most isolated cases. In general, they do not exist. But Electrolux does have a control code, and they have accepted a number of international codes regarding workers' rights. But they did not follow any of these. They fired 100 workers. Many of them were not even participants in the protest. They had simply approached to see what was going on. They're asked to, or required to sign a contract of agreement, and they're given minimal severance pay in violation of all human rights, workers' rights rules. A human rights and union organization contacted the Swedish unions, and from Sweden, they tried to pressure the company's owners. And there was a media campaign within Sweden, which managed to force Electrolux to pay more adequate, not completely adequate, but more adequate severance with some, but not all, of the workers that had been fired. Only some of them had access to this, but some 30 of them did find out about this and were able to demand the secondary severance pay. Finally, in the autumn, they came to an agreement with the company, and finally, they were paid everything that was owed to them, but only to 4 or 5 of those workers. I myself was involved in the committee of support for those workers, and we decided to make a study based on one of the workers fired by Electrolux. We carried out 7 different interviews over May and June of 2021. The women interviewed were women between 25 and 56 years of age, coming from all different parts of the country, most of them with small children. What are the perceptions of these workers? Well, when we try to approach the quality of the work, the working conditions, in general, they claimed to be fairly satisfied. Although, when in the interview, we went more deeply into their experiences, we started to hear that, in fact, the salaries were not so good. The working conditions were not were less good than they hoped or expected. They were assigned many difficult tasks, and there was a continual problem of labor accidents. In the case of one of the interviewed, because the company refused to respond to a labor they also tell us stories of sexual harassment, insecurity in the company's transport system, and especially those that had to go home to faraway neighborhoods.
They say that there is a fear atmosphere. So there is no one that dares to organize in some kind of union. They say they are being fired. They were fired in 2002. It was totally unjustified. It was a traumatizing experience. The oldest ones had lots of difficulties in finding again an employment. So the conclusions is that Sweden European
adapted good salaries, working conditions of Europe, but the codes of conduct that they've signed, and they also belong to global agreements on workers' rights that include the right to allow union organization. So here we have a total contradiction. And in the interest of adapting to a country like Mexico, in which they feel that through the because of corruption, they can cease upholding labor laws and paying lower wages. This is the basic presentation that I have prepared about the Electrolux case. And now we're going to move to the presentations of our colleagues. I don't know if we have Inti with us right now. I don't see her. So instead, I think we will pass the floor to Margarita. Inti is here. Inti is here. Inti is present. Okay, Inti, are you with us? Inti, can you speak? Inti? Hello? Hello? Good afternoon. Now we can hear you. Great. Would you mind? I'm going to introduce you, and then, so we have Inti Barrios Hermano from the Human Rights Commission of the Valley of Tehuacan. She participates. She's going to present the situation of the sewing through theater. She collaborates with a group of artists in a creative space dedicated to communicate the situation of migrant workers through art and theater. So she's going to present the situation of the maquila workers in Puebla and Tehuacan. Thank you, Edme, and everyone. I'm very sorry. We are here in precarious circumstances in terms of our connections. The experience here in Tehuacan has been very varied. There are certain things that have not changed at all in terms of the situation of women, especially with regard to work harassment and sexual harassment. In recent years, we've come across 3 cases of companions that have shared very similar experiences. We thought that the question of harassment of girls and teenagers was something that we had I think we lost contact with Inti just there. I don't know if we still have contact with Inti. If not, we could pass the floor to Margarita. And in that case, we could, until we resume contact with Inti. She's a master in rural development from the University of Xochimilco and was the coordinator of the migrant section in, she's the technical secretary of the table against the exploitation of girls and children, and in the struggle against discrimination and the organization of decent work in. She also forms part of the International Network of Agrarian Workers. Please go ahead, Isabel. Thank you, Edme, and hello to everyone. I'm very grateful for the invitation and the opportunity to form part of this space. Please forgive me for not turning on my camera, but as you see, we have problems of connection. Right now, I am in the state of Guerrero in the mountains. And since yesterday, well, we've had problems with our connections, but since yesterday, we completely lost our signal. So I prefer to speak from my mobile phone without the camera. So the issue of this first block of the seminar principally focused on women workers in industry and in rural areas. I will briefly speak about the work we do in my organization from the National Network of Agrarian Field Workers. What we do is provide accompaniment to persons, day laborers and farm workers who migrate internally. But there's also a local field worker population where there's also an the presence of where they are employed as agrarian workers. This is an issue that has not formed part or has not been a priority within the public agenda in our context here in Mexico, but at a global level, and as an essential population, with great pride, we say that the food arrived in our in a general reading of this, they have always been essential workers, even before the pandemic, and more so now. Because of the precarious situations in which they work. For women in situations of mobility and migration, being salaried laborers in the agrarian sector in Mexico, we know other experiences at a global level. We're looking at similar realities. This is because there are population within the Mexican context, especially, that they have to cover this profile of cheap labor arriving from rural and principally indigenous regions. Many of them have their own land, but they may or may not form part of indigenous communities. There are often not contracts, there are only verbal contracts. So the benefits that these may provide in terms of your labor conditions, they're only by word of mouth. Whether there's going to be a living space, the hours of work, etc. This is informal work. There's no supervision or legality. And the other major problem is that there's no registry that tells us how much of the population is actually doing this kind of work under these conditions. We can't know how many of them are from indigenous communities. We don't know what degree of literacy there are, what indices of marginality or of poverty. All of these elements all make migration an option and forcing people into agrarian work of this type. Making approximations based on a report written by the minimum wage research group. They estimate that some 87% of these workers are men and some 12.7% are women. We might say that this is a low number, but it's a underreported number. There are no numbers since 2009, when the only national survey ever made in Mexico about the agrarian day labor work population. So these official data claim that there are 8.5 million workers doing this kind of work. And as they cover a particular profile, their precariousness begins from the moment in which they're recruited in their communities. They're contracted, they talk about contracts, but these are very often papers that they sign, but they're papers belonging to the company that don't make it all clear what the responsibilities are of the company. And this makes their structural precariousness more acute, like those populations that have to migrate, both those populations that have to migrate and those who live near the agrarian areas themselves. Their precariousness is increased. They have to adapt to speaking Spanish instead of their they often do not come to understand their access to rights. They're subject to an infinitude of situations that transgress or violate their rights. Just to highlight the data of precariousness in which they find themselves, especially women, some sources say that 93% of women day laborers do not have any kind of contract for all of the reasons mentioned before. 90% do not have access to health care provided by if you have access to your right to health, Social Security that might give you the possibility to think about at some point having a pension, or if you suffer an accident, or if a worker dies in the fields, their family may be receive some kind of indemnization. None of that exists. The 8% say they have no kind of benefits of any kind. On the other hand, they sell them daycare centers. There are families that move from one agrarian center to another, from one state to another, carrying out agrarian activities, and this makes it impossible for them to return to their communities of origin, and so they depend upon an extremely hard work. We found that in many fields where women day laborers work between 10 and 13 hours a day, because they work on the basis of what they gather, or so that by the quantity that they gather. So they're paid by the unit of what they collect. So if the trailer is filled by 7 or 8 at night, that's when they end. And these workers may have woken up at 3 or 4 in the morning in order to make the meal for the family, take the children to the daycare, etc., before getting on the bus in order to go to the field. So their days of labor always exceed the hours stipulated by any kind of labor agreement. This is the dominant model in this kind of activity. It's an intensive exploitation model. The contract says that they will work for 8 hours a day, but since they are paid in depending upon the amount that they collect, for example, the workers end up being convinced to work much more. So they may know that they'll get another extra 100 pesos if they do this. So this is very intensive labor based on a kind of activity that goes beyond exploitation and nearly into a situation of slavery. I don't want to overstep the time allotted to me. How much more time do I have? 5 minutes. Okay, thank you, Edne. Hand in hand with this, due to this is bound to good earnings. These are salaries that this population cannot earn at their in their home place. This is a cheapened labor force that puts the women workers and their entire families in such a situation that they cannot even aspire to better labor conditions. So if you are hired to be a bearer, if you know how to read and write, and you can speak in your native language to the other workers in your working team, that is the most that you can possibly aspire to, being a sort of a foreman at a small scale. There's no other ascent possible within the company. I spoke to a companion from an indigenous community, the Nahuas, and this company expanded in Michoacan just recently. And when he described what he was doing, he is essentially doing the work of a agricultural engineer. But according to his pay scale, he is being paid as a foreman. He is responsible for the team of workers. He says, I am being paid well. And he said, and I said, no, but you're not being recognized as you're really doing the work. They're paying you the same as a worker, but you're actually organizing the work. And though they give you greater responsibilities, they're not recognizing or compensating that work that you're doing. So being indigenous people, often single mothers that don't have a support network, these are all situations that make their precariousness greater and more acute. I'd like to highlight also the issue of maternity and breastfeeding in the context of this kind of work. If they're pregnant or if they're breastfeeding a baby, the risks are much greater because of the conditions of the labor that they're doing, but also because their rights are not guaranteed in any way. and also they are in contact with toxic materials at extreme temperatures, and the damage, the harm to their bodies is tremendous. So if women laborers, who are often heads of family and work alone, assume all of these different risks, as well as the maternity and child rearing, they confront this alone because there's no network at a community level that could support them. The issue of care, of labor, of indigeneity, workers that are not in a position to defend their own rights. This is a combination, together with labor exploitation, that makes their poverty and marginality much more acute. This makes it a uncivilized kind of labor that foments increased precariousness. There's a tremendous gender inequality in agrarian work. And this inequality is heightened by ethnic, racial, and migration status situation. As always, the agrarian workers, or as we say, the day labor women or day labor families, have to generate, as they have done historically, their own strategies in order to compensate the institutional failures or absences and the violation of their rights. So there's many responsibilities that are not being addressed by governments. They do not consider this a priority in terms of the political agendas. Without focusing on rights, much less focusing on children, health, multiculturality, etc. So thank you very much for your time. I'm happy to respond to questions. Thank you, Margarita. So now we will pass the floor again to Inti Barrios Hernandez. We hope that her connection is working a little better now. Inti, please go ahead. Thank you, Edme. So from the Commission of Human Rights and Labor Rights in the Valley of Tehuacan, we accompany maquila workers, men and women. There's some 18,000 women working in the maquilas. If one goes to Tehuacan, you can imagine this blue city made by the bodies and the hands of women, as Margarita said. Everything falls on the body of women. We can see in Tehuacan how there's an adding up of violences, very similar to what is experienced in the countryside. In order to translate a little bit, the sweatshops, they're called sweatshops in English, maintaining this capitalist system. Specifically in Tehuacan, we can see that the pandemic made women's conditions even more precarious. They were in one of the factories. We talked to the women who had a thyroid problem or a weight issues, how the company took the pandemic as a pretext to fire these people. These are terrible policies. They sent them to rest, so in quotes, giving off the idea that this was supposed to be very generous, that they were sending them off to rest and protect themselves from COVID with a 200 peso severance. This they maintained over weeks and then months. And when they were supposed to reintroduce them into the labor force, they said, okay, we will eventually, but now you can no longer go back into the into the labor force where you were before. We're going to send you to another location, which is much farther away, harder to get to, much more difficult for them to reach. In this way, they knew that many of these women were going to, in effect, be fired without any form of severance or benefits. And it was quite terrible. We had the support of the Maquila Solidarity Network trying to highlight this through the brands of the materials produced in the maquilas. The ones who were fired were almost all women and almost all people with some kind of health issues. In recent times, we've talked to other workers who, within a shirt pressing and ironing factory floor, we saw again issues of harassment of girls, people under 18 years of age. These are practices that keep being repeated. At some point, it was the global capital of blue jeans. Right now, we are the global capital of the blue waters that are unloaded on the cornfields. So what we see constantly are bad smelling blue foamy water being dumped into a landfill or a slush pool. And it coincides, or it's not such a coincidence, that the majority of the people, especially women, are maquila workers. Many of them are tortilla workers. Here, women have been deeply affected by the environmental impacts, and we can see how all of the environmental impact falls, or the burden is borne by the bodies of women. Here they also dump these polluted waters. There were many cases of girls and of mothers. This was over 10 years ago. It was the mothers of these girls that started to denounce this dumping. Women and men earn some 4,000 pesos a month. This doesn't quite reach cover their rent and other needs. There are not good systems for light, drainage, access to clean water, etc. So oddly enough, this sector is also generating the wealth for those people who are also renting apartments and houses. With our companion Angelica, we've seen how the company owners are actually offering rental housing, because we're talking about lots of migrant women. They say, here you go, you've got your room here, we'll rent it to you. And so you start working already with debts that they acquire in order to establish themselves in the place. And so also the maquila companies prepare the food. So that's a sort of running business going on in the inside of the maquilas themselves. Many of the women were severely affected by the pandemic. In Tehuacan, they started making face masks. So on the one hand, people were dismissed with 200 pesos in order to but then also they were sent to their homes to make face masks. Of course, with 200 pesos, there was no way that they could maintain themselves, much less their children. So they started working on other kinds of other sources of income, like making face masks. Among the notes that have been spread in the newspapers, there's constant situations of harassment and abuse of young women and girls. A study shows that at least 1 out of 3 women are being harassed. I could tell you about some harassment situations or situations of abuse. Very often, Susana, another companion of ours with whom we've worked recently, she's a migrant from Veracruz, and the union of the patronal, the representative of the union, was also harassing her, sexually harassing her. So while they are fighting for a fair wage, they go to the union for support. And they say, no, there are these new negotiation boards. I can help you out. This fellow appears in so many cases of sexual harassment of workers, both while they're working and outside of the work. Certain windows have opened to the possibility of representation within the unions, but this is all in shadowy circumstances. And here they said, many of our companions have said that there would be, that they were told that there would be a vote, but then nothing was explained to them. They weren't told anything about it until just before the vote. And the issue arose again, how the company owners were appearing to coerce anyone that had received a ballot for the voting, were threatened with being fired. So I see the maquila as a great accumulation of violences, especially against women, with regard to their physical health, their mental health, their economic health. How this maquila, how the work that they do continues to sustain the lives of their children, but also of this system. I'm not sure how much time I have. You have 5 more minutes. Here we see all of this repetition of forms of violence. For example, some 18,000 women are working in the maquilas, but we're talking about those are only those that are registered officially, but there are so many different home sweatshops or undercover sweatshops in which, for example, the mother, the granddaughter, the daughter, the daughter-in-law, and various others, they're doing this sort of final, for example, putting on buttons or cutting off threads. These are family-based workshops, but once again, you always see the female faces there, and the ones who are feeding the women are also women that are making the tortillas and the tacos. This is the most accessible food to the maquila workers, because, like Margarita said, otherwise they have to wake up extremely early in order to be able to make their own food, in order to have a lunch during the day. There's also this issue of unpaid extra hours, work days that end up stretching out to 12 hours a day. Everyone in Tehuacan, there was a public electric network established when the women workers explained that they were going to pay the same amount as the women are paying the tax for that electric system, even though they're living in sort of sub housing units. And these women are paying for the whole system while being exploited, invisibilized, and their rights violated. This is the big secret that no one wants to mention. Everybody wants to just see the blue jeans that are being made in the maquila. No one wants to see the lives behind this industrial clothing manufacture. So I think I've taken up the time allotted to me. Yes, thank you, Inti. We've gone through the presentations of these three participants. And before passing the floor to the audience, which I think may have various comments or questions, I would like to clarify that we only have the chat in which to write your questions. We don't have the ability to invite you to ask your questions in person. So please go ahead and ask any questions you may have in the chat. So while you're formulating those questions, I'd like to make a couple of reflections precisely about Inti and Margarita's presentations, about labor conditions and so on. I think here we can see clear indices of increasing precariousness impelled by globalization, because many of these companies, even if they're at the very height of Mexican capital, they are principally oriented to international foreign capital. In the case of Electrolux that I told, it's very clear, the link to European capital. In this webinar, we're focusing principally on the European Union, but it's a very similar situation of when it's other forms of foreign capital, whether it's from the United States, the European Union, or from Asia. One of the notes that I am taking down about these presentations is looking at the common tendencies. What maquilas and agro-industry have in common. They're subject to foreign regulation and capital. Although they may be national enterprises, much of the capital and much of the products that they make are going for export. They push down prices. They are an amalgam of different forms of violence, and that all of these have gotten worse since the pandemic or during the pandemic. These are often women who are single mothers, or I think this is a very common point with both maquilas and agro-industry, and facing conditions of environmental deterioration that will have effects upon the lives, and the work, and the ongoing support of these women. Before giving the floor to the audience, I would like to ask both Margarita and Inti, in your observations, do you keep in mind any kind of foreign capital or company that you can identify? That's a question for you, Inti or Margarita. Margarita, please go ahead. No, Inti, please go. Okay. There are many companies from the United States and from Canada. We identified one of the brands. I can't remember the name right now, but they make clothing for engineers. So and it's a compound that avoids the flammability. All the rubbish collectors, for example, wear this brand. Many of these are foreign companies. In Tehuacan, we principally are working for United States and Canadian brands that are then sold throughout the world. With the issue of agro-industry, the companies are progressively more and more, especially those that are in the northwest of the Mexican geography. These are transnational companies that export products. There are also some small companies, so it's fairly diverse, but much of this market works with intermediaries that are the supermarkets present in Mexico, from Chedraui, Walmart, and these connect to the other chains. These are supermarkets that form part of the chain of production that distribute these products, as do the various different agrarian companies. Sometimes these change depending upon the situation of the company itself. You spoke about American or North American, Canadian, and United States companies. Are there European companies present there? Not that I know of, but there are brands. I'm looking right now. There are brands that get distributed in Europe. They're for engineers. It's a brand that has like a Tesla symbol. In agro-industry, let's say that while we know that the trade is oriented to Asia and Europe, one of those that has been identified has to do with berries, especially strawberries. In Mexico and the United States, there are companies like Belimex that have sister companies or trade in Spain, especially, and also in other parts of Europe. In Spain, there is a relationship with the production of strawberries, so it's cyclical. There are these different agrarian cycles that guarantee that the products are never lacking, often under different names. We have a comment or question here. The situation of the workers of maquilas and of agro-industry is something that is a great concern to social organizations of women as part of the agenda of Indigenous women. If you could So if you could speak a little bit more about workers of indigenous origins. Would either of you like to address that? In Tehuacan, the majority of the maquila workers are indigenous women. There's a very powerful wave of migration from the Nahua region, from the Mazateca. The employers say, no, there are no indigenous workers here, but we know that this is very common. There's a report that talks about this this migration and how the maquilas have broken a lot of the social bonds in the indigenous communities, and there's a great loss of the language. Despite this, if you go into the factories, people are speaking Nahua. The younger generations often don't want to speak Nahua. Sometimes the young people want to step out of the world of the maquila, of the factories. They have different life expectations. They expect to go out to there's also a whole cultural question present that would give us a lot to talk about and to analyze. Thank you, Inti. And Margarita, please go ahead. Yes, here, the ideal profile for this sector, I don't remember exactly how much indigenous population form part of this, but we know that it's the majority in the agrarian sector. The majority are indigenous women. This is complex in terms of the labor relationship that they can establish. One, because in large part, the leader or the foreman of the workforce is usually a man, not because of norms, but because those who at some point had the option or the opportunity to learn Spanish are usually the men. And so the men are usually the first ones pushed out to establish labor relations, even though increasingly there are indigenous women who have tried to join as foremen, but generally, if they don't speak Spanish, if they have difficulties with literacy, this makes it very greatly increases their vulnerability. In the fields, it is very common. Here in the mountain region in Guerrero, you see families that come into Tlapa, and in any given group, there may be several pregnant women. They go into Sinaloa, and in just 4 months, she's going to be working in the fields without any kind of benefits or protections, and then the child will be born. So in this situation for them is extremely complicated. And it's very difficult for them to carry out organizational experiences. There are government entities that whose objective is to accompany indigenous population in the north of Mexico, but these have been prepared and written from an office somewhere, and they really don't connect with the reality. We need to talk about the realities that these indigenous women encounter in the fields. These are conditions that do not encourage. So there are plans, and they've been presented, and in principle, there's a protection of their rights. But if I go into here we call them estapones. So there's these are sticks that are dug into the ground to support the plants, and carrying these and driving them into the earth. This is a very difficult labor. And it's very difficult for them to carry that pole, dig the hole, drive it in, cover it up. This is a dangerous task because of how the procedure is carried out. But that's not discussed. That's not, so we could say, like, you have to demand better working conditions in the sense of better salaries, but it's also all kinds of issues like this in the day-to-day activities that women workers carry out, often under threat, and they very often those who are preparing these supposed protections or codes are not aware of how agro-industry works. We keep getting questions in the chat. Please remember that you can also raise your hand if anyone, any of the speaker or any of the people present here today would like to ask a question. We can do that. In the presentations, do you have anything else you would like to add that you haven't been able to do because of the restricted time? I'm sorry, I couldn't hear the last thing you said. If there's anything you would like to add, anything that you weren't able to discuss in the first round because you didn't have time. If you'd like to add anything, please go ahead and do so. No, like I said, the issue is complicated, complex, and this is something that the governments wanted to establish because they acknowledge the essential character of agrarian workers. In the seminar, you want to talk about the free trade agreement. Mexico has a free trade agreement with the United States and Canada, even though this has a labor code within it and claims to guarantee the best conditions against forced labor or child labor. It's very complicated. To talk first about eradication without integrated and holistic public policies. And that means you need to begin by listening to these families. We can't respond only to statistics or numbers. We can't say that this is going to come to an end. Exploitation in the countryside is historic, and they may no longer have chains on their feet or a foreman whipping them, but that doesn't mean that the supervisor doesn't need a whip. He's watching them with a watch. The whip is a verbal one now. This is a tremendous degree of exploitation that's sort of covers over near slavery conditions. We need to look very seriously about the impact of these treaties. They're not being carried out through a dialogue and open communication with the affected communities. These documents may have some impact somewhere, but not upon the populations that are subject to these vulnerable situations. So that's what I would like to add. Inti, would you like to add something? What I've been hearing from Margarita is very similar. The factory is a plantation and the plantation is a factory. I mean, really, these are very similar and very terrible, very intense labor environments. There's an intense physical work. I had to once do a work of a theater piece about the maquilas, and it was terrible to do those movements, just to see the physical impact of the movements that these women have to make. And many women could identify the illness or the pains that they had arose from the lack of any kind of prevention or any kind of health care, how they're exposed to all kinds of chemical compounds in the cleaning rooms. Likewise, death by black lung or silicosis. The sandblasting of, this is a terrible habit. People die. And those that do that kind of work are usually men, not women. Recently, 5 workers died. And when an autopsy was conducted, you could see their under their face mask was completely full of silica sand. So the factory pushes people, and migration is also present, the possibility of migrating to another country, but also the migration that's arriving into these factory areas. It says here in the chat that the impunity of the free trade of the international companies has been the same over decades, or has it increased or has it decreased? Have there been changes, and what would be the reasons for those changes? Inti, could you respond to that? I believe that it's continued. Despite all the discourse and the review in Mexico, in the context of Tehuacan, is that this continues. In fact, no, I'd say this is on the increase, because this is being added to the other forms of violence. In Tehuacan, we're seeing an increase in feminicides, and many of these women are maquila workers. I don't want to be too pessimistic, But I see in Tehuacan a situation very similar to that in the north of the country some years ago. I'm seeing how all of these forms of violence are adding up and working together to continue exploitation, oppression, and pollution. For me, it's no surprise that the maquila, this is the modality and of impunity. Do you feel that the degree of exploitation has increased in recent decades? I agree with Inti. It's continued, but I would say that it's almost more of a costume, a mask. This impunity, it's like a mask, and this mask, now we talk about good practices and social responsibility to the extent that the agro industry claims to have standards of social responsibility. It's breaking any records. There are companies that exceptionally have, but what we've seen is responding to the needs and of the treaty that Mexico has with North America and Canada. It's been permitting the expansion of the chain of distribution and trade and sales of its products, but also with different kinds of certifications that guarantee that they uphold standards of social responsibility or that they don't violate rights. But these are often emitted by external companies, consultants, or local governments. And what I've seen personally, especially by visiting agrarian fields, the population, they're told that they have to say exactly what they have to say when there are inspections or reviews. And these inspections, you have to say, for example, they'll say that you have to say that no children work here, or they'll take people to visit only the first of a series of greenhouses, and they put the workers that are prepared to respond to their questions. So for example, I went to one camp in which they carried away the children in the camp. The families that were present, and this is not the first time that we've seen this, it's exactly the same. If that is the kind of impunity, it's continuous, and it's just a way of perpetuating the situation. I will pose this as a question. When a worker passes away, these agreements don't have any, algunos workers have died from labor accidents or as a consequence of their work. If a worker dies because of agro chemicals, for example, it is not accepted. They don't accept if they've died, like they're not recognized in the death certificate. They don't mention that they were run over by a tractor or exposed to chemicals. if the family of the worker decides to denounce and to seek a penal process on the family, the agreements don't mention this. It's not discussed, and it's also not present in our national laws. If these agreements require other kinds of negotiated agreements. I'd say that this impunity, to connect to the topic of these webinars, so it's a continuation of the if there's a treaty with Europe, it's because it benefits the corporations from Europe. This means that there's greater impunity because, as I said before, the double standards of European companies that don't respect the legislation or the safeguards of rights that are present in Europe simply ignore these safeguards in countries like Mexico. We saw that in the case of Electrolux. And as Margarita mentioned, when there are exterior monitors, because in Electrolux, they hired a company to carry out investigation of what had happened, and the results of that investigation, which they themselves had supported, were never released. They weren't published because they were not convenient. The pressure of the European Union they refused to accept the continuation of this kind of treaties does nothing but establish or make more permanent this kind of impunity, this kind of exploitation. And this is why
That's why we are critical with modernization under these terms, because it would serve same patterns as you are telling us, and which could be very enduring. I see that we don't have any more questions. I would like to make a question, please. Yes, Maria? Well, it's very moving. All the testimonies that you are sharing with us. It's painful, very painful. But there is an element which I would like to ask. What kind of defense the workers may have, the workers from the different places. So I would like to know more about organizing, about what kind of strength could you build. Organization may give all these workers strength. In the case of day laborers in Sinaloa and Sonora, it seems that there was some organizing in this sense. Are there any conditions so that the workers may organize? Margarita, please. It's complex, Maria. I would say this is a key element, and there is a very rich experience by the Democratic Independent Union, SINJA, which arise in Valle San Quintín in Southern California. This
The
union was
problems
able
that
to put
the
forward
sector
all
was
the issues in the sector.
encountering, and they were only publishing what was happening in San Quintín and in other states where they were hired. So even though other experiments were opened in other states and there were different outbreaks, it was complicated because of the mobility of the population. They're very migratory processes. They coincide perhaps for some months or for a season in certain agrarian fields. This doesn't mean that in some agrarian areas, and this is not recently, this happened before San Quintín also, in some areas there were reactions, ways in which they have stopped production. This was most visible in Sinaloa, but these were small groups. Many of them were not part of any formal union, but they go from one state or one region to another. Some of them have gotten inspired to organize themselves, but they use other mechanisms, other strategies. For example, if they don't pay me correctly, or the whole team walks out, and I don't mean 20 or 40, I mean sometimes an entire community, and that affects the company because they'll suddenly be short 100 or 200 workers. That's a real blow to them. That's something that organizations have been trying to support. And we see that these organizational processes have to be community-based. So encouraging these communities to establish grassroots, ground level complicities and organization. So we are talking about organizational processes in the fields, but they have to be woven together from the communities, seeking ways in which to have a voice and a vote, but together. I'd love to describe these. I could do that for another half an hour, but it's a accumulation of various different factors. We have to be optimistic. There have been struggles, there have been battles, and I think we can look at those in order to develop processes that are much more collective. I'd like to respond. If we give the floor to Inti to respond to that question. I think Inti left. Oh, she must have been disconnected. I wanted to highlight something with regard to Maria's question. An organizational process would be useful, but I'd also like to highlight international solidarity, because in the case that I presented of Electrolux, what really saved the situation for many of the workers was the support of Swedish unions. The unions from the sort of mother country of the company. This support was key for the company to give up and pay adequately of at least some of these workers. So in addition to local support, the support of international solidarity and unions, I know that that's extremely difficult. And in this conflict, for example, he said you have to organize at a union level. There was simply no way of pulling together that kind of organization within the maquila. They were so constrained by the fear of unemployment that they didn't dare to organize. Maria, you had another question? This is a comment in relation to this campaign that we have here. This campaign to not sign the ratification of the treaty, the free trade treaty between Europe and Mexico. We should simply remember a few things that have to do with this. This global treaty was signed in 1997, and in 2000 it was ratified. But in fact, the economic and trade part was signed. So the so-called economic union, there are three different elements: the economic union, but also political. These three elements are what are at this moment in disagreement between the government of Mexico and the European Union with regard to the ratification and modernization of the treaty. What I would like to highlight here is that this seminar, this webinar that we are offering, is not only in order to see if there are European organizations present in these moments, but also to make visible the violation of human rights present in the country in every way, in all different aspects: economic, social, labor, environmental, territorial. And in this regard, these agro industries, which install themselves and exploit at near slavery levels, men and women, whole families throughout the whole country. This has been happening for a long time. This could be a question for Margarita. People leave their communities because they don't have labor or life conditions in those places. And so they set out to find other ways of life in order to survive. The question is, how much the lands, the communal lands that are abandoned by these migrating communities, and at the same time, what happens with those lands? Because if we're hearing Inti and Margarita, it's because it has to do with the lands that are being exploited. These are no longer workable lands because of the blue paint, the toxins. These lands can no longer be used for growing healthy food. The land becomes toxic. And then people can no longer live. The agro industry that has to do with avocado, with strawberry, with blueberries, and all these kinds of products, these are destroying whole regions, forests, in order to establish these industries. So we are desertifying the lands by hundreds of hectares of land. Margarita, would you like to add something? I'd just like to say that, yes, this reflection from Maria, that's an important part of this debate. It's this debate also carries along other issues. This predatory way of looking at these lands, many of these migrations, many people migrate because of for economic reasons, but also often it's forced. Often they're displaced because their lands, because mega projects have entered into their regions and the lands have been stripped of them. And this affects principally indigenous communities, though not only. And often everything that a mega project might entail is greater than the impact of the community. So how these struggles are accompanied with other struggles, there are structures that are there in order to continue violating rights and preying upon communities in the ways that have been described. How do we hold ourselves firm in the midst of these processes as organizations, as a society, in order not to abandon these spaces of reflection about what's happening? Thank you, Margarita. Inti is not able to connect, but we are writing via WhatsApp. Someone asked something about labor organizations. You can answer here via WhatsApp. Do you think that there is what the possibilities, the labor possibilities of these workers that you described, if there's organizational possibilities there? Can you hear me? We're trying to start a project. I can't hear her, I'm sorry. We feel that, I'm sorry, I really can't hear her. In order to do something that's more continuous, part of the organizational process arises from situations of firings, of very specific conflicts in specific factories. At the moment, this is not, this hasn't arisen. So now we're working on weaving this process back together. And we want to do this through popular communication. I'm sorry, I can't hear her very well. In this context, in order to have an impact in these situations. Now, I can't hear anyone. Yeah, I think we're just on standby.
Hello, this is Gea Meyers. We're technically hosting the webinar, and there seems to be some problems.
Maria, did you hear what Inti asked? Rather, what Inti said? Sorry, I got disconnected, but now I'm back. So, I don't know if you'd like to add something, or I don't see. Or should we move on to conclude this seminar? I believe that in this depressing context, I'd like to think in terms of what the Zapatista companions say, that this is a situation of oppression that robs us of joy, but we also have to seek these spaces in which we can weave together solidarity and listening and organizational work, educational work, and defense, and also accompany this with other spaces of joy and festivity in order to have the strength to confront these situations. It's a very oppressive situation, but we have to seek out how to confront it. Margarita, would you like to say any last words? Yes. Thank you, Edme. The issue is complex, but that doesn't mean that from our different trenches, we can't join forces, listen actively, make space for the voices of those that are experiencing directly. There are so much to listen to from women field workers and their families, and it all adds up. We have to continue demanding. I think we need to talk about social justice. And for social justice to achieve, there has to be a will to change, and we all have to be in the battle. From our responsibility as consumers of these products, we have to be able to think about who is behind these products, the persons, the individuals that allow this product to be grown and harvested and transported. This is an issue of social responsibility. Thank you very much. I would also say a few last words in the sense that we have to continue weaving networks and support. But I would also say that we have to think about transnational solidarity. As I mentioned earlier, this is very important. In order, I've seen this work in various cases to improve a situation. In the case of Electrolux, it was absolutely central to be able to resolve the situation for at least some of the workers, establishing these bonds with labor organizations outside the country, whether in Europe or in the United States. I think this is a very vital support, these transnational networks of solidarity. I don't know, Maria, if you would like to add anything else? Yes, I'd like to say that each session of the seminar, the next one, which is October 13th, and the one after that, that's October 19th, has its own league. So that we can include these in, it has its own link. Each one has its own link. So in order to enter into the seminar correctly, please keep an eye out and make sure that you get the correct link to the Zoom. We also remind you to sign this letter against the ratification of the free trade agreement between Europe and Mexico. Thank you, Maria. And indeed, this is the first of 3 seminars, 3 webinars The next one is in a week on October 13th. After that, there will be another on the 19th, where we will repeat some issues, but the next one is focused on the issue of territory, environment, and indigenous and peasant women. In the third one, there will be some issues that we already addressed here, but focusing on feminicides and the violations of the human rights of women. So thank you very much for having participated. Please make sure you look carefully at the links and take a look at the letter that's available in the chat and sign it if you can. Thank you to our translators, Maggie and Marta, and this seminar is being recorded in order to be distributed and viewed in various sites, which we will later indicate to you. Thank you very much to everyone. And now we disconnect.